This is what we call show and tell. My wife brings this to the farmer's market and shows people how we process the coffee. So far I've already showed you the water process. That's when they just take it down to parchment by fermenting it, drying it in the sun down to 12% or less, and then storing it. I like to store it a little while just so that the water can equalize between inside the bean and between the beans, so you get a nice even roast. Another method again was the honey coffee, where they only make it in Brazil because it's so wet, and the reason they call it honey processed is because it's so sticky. It's sticky like honey. There is no honey in it. It does look like Cracker Jack or caramel corn when it's in its dried state, but that's just the sugar that was on the cherry naturally. A third method is the naturals, and you have more control on these than you would over the fourth form, which is called raisins. This is where I pick them on the tree myself. I pick the best cherries. I try not to get any stems on them. I dry them for 2 nights in my food dehydrator, 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And it makes for a cherry that will go out in the sun and dry in about 7 days. I further discovered that by taking the skin off and not throwing it away, as is normally done when you take it to somebody to have the parchment removed, I crank this all by hand into a bag, or I have help actually. One person pours and the other person cranks. It's very time consuming, but by taking off the outer skin, which is the fruit, and the inner lining of the mucilage, which is dried, which is mostly sugar, I grind it all, put it back in the same bag, and then let it sit for a number of days. I've discovered about 2 weeks is sufficient, but what it ends up doing is it allows the green bean, which is what you end up with at the time of roast, to place this fruit and sugar in direct contact with the green bean. My wife found on the internet, found that it's referred to as green bean conditioning. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. I just discovered it myself. So that leads for a very fruity, non-acidic cup of coffee, because you're not acidifying it in the process of putting it in the water soaking process, which creates 6 different types of acid and alcohol. A fourth way of processing coffee is to take the cherry that's already been dried directly off the tree. I've done this in several locations, and it makes a big difference on how much weather they get in that location after the cherry's dried. Because if it's re-fermented, re-wetted, it will tend to ferment as it gets wet and dry and wet and dry. And I picked those in the Yao Valley before, and they end up tasting like dirt. Whereas these, it's kind of a nutty flavor, a little fruitiness, definitely different taste than water process, and it's the way they made coffee until 140 years ago. So I offer all 4 of these processes. You end up with the coffee in the roasted form. Also pick a small bean referred to as a mocha, that's a 1,000-year-old variety for what is now part of Yemen, was originally Ethiopia, where the original coffee comes from. They're a small bean, and I'd say about the quarter of the size of a regular coffee bean. And a little difficult to roast because you have to be right on it, and you don't want to over roast them so you can retain the natural flavor of the bean. This is the skin of the coffee cherry. In this case, these were red cherries, so they have a slightly red tinge. This is another thing I use my food dehydrator for, because it's got a lot of water in it to begin with, and the process would be to wash your cherries very thoroughly. I do it 3 times and rinse them, so there's no loose material in the coffee. I try to pick them again with no stems, so I don't end up with any stem material. And then I pick out the little flecks of white material, which is the dead half of the coffee bean from what would have been a pea berry. You have the pea berry on one side and a little dead fleck of parchment on the other. So I pick those out too, just for cosmetic purposes. It probably wouldn't affect the taste of it. But I dry this for approximately, well, first of all, I pulp it, put it in a clean container. I wash my pulper thoroughly, put it in a clean container, and then put it on a towel and try to wring out as much moisture as possible, because there's quite a bit of moisture in the skin itself. Then I put it on one skin deep as much as I can to get 9 full racks in the food dehydrator, and that usually will be about, say, 20 to 25 pounds of cherry skins that I can get in there. Dry them for 2 days, or 2 nights rather, and that gets the skins so that they're nice and crackly and fresh. And if you were to just crackle them with a clean hand, you could take them down to a finer size that you could use for your tea. In other cases, I've seen this size directly sold as a tisane, which is, it's a tea, but it's not a true Camellia sinensis, so you can't really call it a tea. It doesn't have any tea in it, so they call it a fruit tisane, or in Spanish it's called a cascara for skin or peel. So it makes a very fruity type of tea. You want to use between about 5 and 8 grams and 8 ounces of hot water or boiling water, and you can flavor it with like a stick of cinnamon or some ginger or any other spice you might want to add a little flavor to, but it already has its natural tea flavor to it, light fruity flavor, and it's a different type of caffeine effect than you would encounter in a regular cup of coffee, which is why some people like it. The honey coffee looks like after 2 days, it's taking on a nice kind of a yellowish finish. If I were to leave it in the dehydrator, say for another day to a day and a half, it would take on this darker reddish appearance, which is basically just the sugars caramelizing. Because I've noticed that you don't get white lines in the coffee that you notice from them being put in the sun. You don't get that in either the case of the raisins, the naturals, or the honey coffee. I'm thinking now that there isn't much of an advantage to putting them in the sun at all, other than using them as a medium to dry them rather than having to use electricity. So I do this just to get the initial moisture off, and then I can even take these whole racks and put them off for another day or two until they're extremely dry, and then just crack them off the plastic rack, which is convenient. So this is the whole key to the operation. I was given this years ago, so I'm not even sure if they still make them, but I brought it here to Hawaii when we moved here 6 years ago in our container. With this, I can make the cascara by putting the skins on the sheet and inserting them in the rack and setting the temperature for generally 125. They say the best temperatures for drying coffee are between 125 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit rather. So this is used for both drying the skins, the cascara. I use it for making the naturals. You have to lift the rack up a little bit to squeeze the next rack in. Or the honey coffee, where I slather the beans onto these racks. About 4 cups will cover a rack, and then I spend about 45 minutes loading the racks to come out with honey coffee. Again, that is dried for 2 days, and that's enough dryness to be able to put it in the sun to finish it. But without this, I wouldn't be making any of these other processes because the coffee would just be too wet to put outside.